as the 2023 matric class eagerly awaits their final exam results, excessive and persistent worry and fear are an all-time high. Statistics reveal that teen deaths as a result of suicide are rife at this time of the year. Parents and guardians are especially urged to keep a watchful eye on their grade 12 children's mental well-being. For more on this conversation, now joined by social worker Jonathan Hoffenberg. Jonathan, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this evening. What are some of the common signs and symptoms of anxiety and depression in matriculants while they wait for the exam results?
You know, what we've seen globally is an increased level of teen mental health issues, largely because of COVID and the spillover of that. And I think the thing, like all grief work is work. And whilst your teen might be experiencing, I think the first thing that parents need to be recognizing is that sometimes parents feel that grief work almost more than the teens. And in a sense, what you need to do in supporting your teens when they're dealing with failure is put aside your own grief, because children are this weird extension of yourself. Sometimes parents put a lot of their own aspirations and dreams into their teens, and sometimes we find that the parent is more upset about the matric results than necessarily the teenager. So the first thing to remember as a parent is it's not about you, it's about them. So the type of things that you often see with teens around depression is, and this is why teen depression can be difficult, because teens are developmentally at a time when they're withdrawing from you. They're not talking to you like they used to. And so often the classical signs of depression, which is, you know, a withdrawal, a lack of communication, a lack of energy, you know, sleeping a lot, not having appetite, not having contact with their usual social friends and that type of stuff, cannot be noticed by parents because it's teens sometimes just being teens.
So during that period of withdrawal and non-eating, how then can a support system of network and friends and family help alleviate this anxiety and stress during this period?
Well, I think the most important thing, and this applies to any loss, is don't minimize, you know, stay with the emotion. One of I think the difficulties of being a teenager, especially these days in a society that puts a lot more emphasis on children, a lot more emphasis on individuality, is that we have a tendency to minimize the emotions of teens. So if you remember the first time you fell in love, and maybe your mother or father, and here maybe this is my self-disclosure, came along and said, "Oh, lots of fish in the sea," you know, and you felt so incredibly betrayed. So the emotions that they're experiencing, whilst from your perspective and your years might go, well, you know, in the broader scheme of things, this isn't such a big deal. It's a huge thing for them. So stay with the emotion. Empathy is identifying what the other person is feeling and acknowledging those feelings. So acknowledging that I know that you're upset. I know that you're disappointed. I know that this is not what you wanted. And in essence, you need to stay in that stage until they themselves transition out of this, you know, spiral that a lot of people often have when they've experienced loss, which is why sometimes dealing with grief when you're the outside person can be kind of a little bit boring, because they just keep on talking about it over and over again. But that's part of their process, and you need to be there for them during that process. So that's the first thing, the showing the empathy. Then once they've started to acknowledge their feelings and you've acknowledged their feelings, you can then start to, with that empathy, moving on to talking about how you failed, talking about how everybody fails, talking about how often we learn from failure more than we learn from success. You know, before I worked for the Parent Center for over 10 years, I worked at UCT and the University of Cape Town. And one of the things that makes the university different is that you have smart kids from all over the country, all over the world coming who have never failed something. And everybody fails something at university. That's the nature of university.
You're right.
And you learn more from failing than you do from success. And that's sometimes something important to kind of say, that it's okay, things are temporary. The modern world is a lot more fluid than it's ever been, which can also be difficult for parents to accept.
Most certainly. So in them accepting that failure and going through that empathy, what are some of the effective coping mechanisms and strategies that matriculants can use to manage the anxiety during this time, especially while waiting for results?
Well, I mean, let's recognize that the South African schooling system is 12 years in which you've specialized in a very limited, small model. I think one of the challenges for a lot of matriculants is they've learned through their school systems, their teachers, how to cope. Suddenly along comes the matric exam, which is a national exam. You might be asking different questions. The levels might be different. They're having to cope with that, but they're leaving a system that they've really specialized in for the last 12 years. So it's about, as I said, seeing the bigger picture, that you are who you are. It sounds kind of cliche, but you are who you are for the whole of your life, and you have the whole of your life to figure it out. And I think the whole system of high school and matric is it overemphasizes this last year. It overemphasizes, and especially the old world of work where, like the voice of God was supposed to look down upon you and say, you will be a news presenter for the rest of your life, or
right.
You're going to be a lawyer, or those days are gone. The world of work is fluid. We're going to be many things. There's, as our great, President Madiba said, it's about lifelong learning. So once you've empathized, once you've stuck with the emotions, once you've recognized the failure, it's about helping them problem solve about what are my alternatives, what are my other things that I can do. Let me widen the lens, so to speak.
Is this unique to South African matriculants? Are there educational institutions that possibly introduce programs well in advance, from grade 10 perhaps, that help prepare matriculants for this period?
Do you know, and we, when I worked for UCT, us lefties used to say that the current generation was so different from our generation when we were, protesting apartheid, that they seemed apathetic, that they weren't interested in any political struggle. And along came Fees Must Fall, and a lot of universities have gone through quite a difficult period. But I think the thing is that one of the, and this is kind of linked to the call to decolonize education, the Western model of education has been the most successful product of colonialization. Every place in the world pretty much schools its kids in the same way. And so we're all encountering the problem. And certain countries have it almost worse. If you look, for example, at mental health in a lot of Asian countries, where you've got, your average Asian teen is doing 16 hours of work a day on schoolwork.
Sure.
They do a crazy amount. The South Koreans have an exceptionally high suicide rate because of this, so I think this is an issue that all countries are facing. I think it's linked to the kind of knowledge production that we have, and it's linked to this old model of work that we have. So if you're struggling and feeling you're alone, you're not. This is an international issue.
Wow, Jonathan. So are there any specific self-care practices or activities that matriculants can engage in to help alleviate the stress and redirect their focus?
I think, one, it's about looking at social capital. So who are the people that you know around you? And I think this is often the challenge of kids that are coming to university, for example, for the first time. If you've grown up in a family where people have gone to university, where people have gone to higher education, you know that often things are not linear, that things are about failure, that you come in wanting to be an engineer and exit the other way, being a clay potter. So I think it's about looking at your social circle, looking at what they do in terms of work, looking at diversity of work, encouraging teenagers to find those part-time jobs if they can, and letting them, experiment with thinking out of the box. Because often, and I go back to this point, that we've had a 12-year process that pretty much trains matriculants to be, I want to be one thing. And then this big failure comes along and they're completely lost. So acknowledge that they're lost and let them problem solve for the alternatives. And talk about model yourself, how you have learned from your mistakes. Mm-hmm. So, and it's difficult to have those heart-to-heart conversations with teens. So, the holiday time is a great time to have conversations with your teen whilst you're standing or sitting side by side. So as you're doing the dishes together, as you're braaiing together, as you're packing away the Christmas tree together, open yourself up to those conversations.
Most certainly. And of course, many of those teens that feel so vulnerable are those that have high expectations, or parents who have high expectations of how their teenagers are to perform. How can matriculants then maintain a sense of perspective and realistic expectations, both the matriculants and the parents, with regards to avoiding that undue stress or thoughts of self-harm?
I think it's about, there's if you've, within the world of business, for example, there's this whole notion of a SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and strength and threats. So SWOP. And I think taking your teens through those type of thought exercises, where they look at their options, where they map out some things in a non-judgmental way. And I think what is also important, and I think this is often also difficult for people who aren't in a social circle where there are people who have gone to higher learning, is if you speak to people who work at universities, they will talk about how often the students that are really prized are mature age students, are students who are coming to university beyond the age of 23. Because there are a number of things. For example, law, one of the best ways of studying law is doing a postgrad once you've already done a degree. Because law can be a bit boring to learn. You need to be quite disciplined. So it suits someone who's already got a degree, who's got a few years, who's had that after school matric party kind of worked out of them. So it's about looking at the bigger picture and helping your teens to look at the bigger picture. And in this sense, and I suppose online, social media is really useful. If you look at a number of really successful people who became successful in their later lives, the author of Harry Potter, Albert Einstein, a lot of people who are famous these days only really found themselves in their late 20s, even in their 30s. There's time. You're going to be you for the rest of your life. It's not a race.
It certainly is not a race. Lastly, Jonathan, how can schools or institutions address and provide mental health support to all matriculants, not just those at high risk during this challenging time?
I think it's about identifying those teachers, and especially the teachers that aren't necessarily doing the hard subjects. I don't want teachers to be angry with me when I say that, for example, maths or science is more hard than, let's say, something like home economics. But if you're a coach, for example, often a coach in that after school, those extramural activities are more able to focus in on the mental health of students. So I think teachers who are in that position, that they're, for example, in the anime club or the debating club or, the music club, are much more able to see that, Thomas always comes and plays the tuba. He hasn't come for 2 weeks. Let's check in. When you're checking in on kids, to let them know that you see them. Not necessarily that you're asking them, how are things, etc., but when people feel seen, because one of the things that often is common in a lot of teen suicides is teens feeling that they have no one to turn to, they're all alone, nobody sees their pain. We have a tendency to be quite narcissistic, quite self-centered when we're a teen. And so reaching out to teens who are in need and just letting them know, I'm here for you if you need me. It can sometimes be as simple as that.
Well, certainly, Jonathan, a very enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That was social worker Jonathan Hoffenberg speaking to us there, how matriculants can get through the time of waiting for those dreaded matric results. Well,